The fluorescent lights in the office conference room buzzed like angry insects as Richard Brennan's laughter cut through the air like a blade. Late nights coding? Marcus, you're still here playing with your little pet project? His voice dripped with contempt, loud enough for the entire development team to hear. My fingers froze over the keyboard, the lines of code blurring in front of my eyes as heat crept up the back of my neck. 8 months of sacrifice, 8 months of staying behind after everyone left, surviving on cold coffee and determination, reduced to a punchline. I could feel every pair of eyes in that room on me, some pitying, others relieved it wasn't them. Richard adjusted his expensive watch, the kind that cost more than I made in 3 months, and smirked. Maybe if you focused on your actual job instead of these fantasies, you'd be worth the salary we pay you. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words died in my throat like ash. My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack, and I forced myself to look down at my screen, at the software that had consumed every spare moment of my life for nearly a year. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid, spreading into my limbs, making my hands shake slightly as I pretended to keep working. Around me, keyboards clacked back to life as my co-workers turned away, the moment already forgotten by everyone except me. Richard walked past my desk, and I caught the scent of his cologne, expensive, suffocating, the smell of a man who'd never had to fight for anything in his life. He paused just long enough to drop a stack of bug reports on my desk with a heavy thud. These need to be fixed by Monday. You know, actual work. Then he was gone, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown timer. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the reports without really seeing them. My reflection in the dark monitor showed a man I barely recognized, eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights, face drawn and tired, beard growing patchy because I kept forgetting to trim it. When had I become this? When had I let myself become someone who could be mocked in front of his peers without consequence? The office around me continued its normal rhythm, phones ringing, the coffee machine gurgling, Sarah from accounting laughing at something on her screen. Life went on as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been publicly humiliated by a man who couldn't code his way out of a paper bag. But something inside me had shifted, cracked open like an egg, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never forget this moment. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. My apartment that night felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with a suffocating intimacy I hadn't noticed before. I'd moved into this one bedroom in Brooklyn 3 years ago, back when the job at Brennan Technologies seemed like a dream opportunity, a chance to work with cutting-edge software, to learn from industry leaders, to build something meaningful. The furniture was minimal, a worn leather couch I'd bought second-hand, a desk cobbled together from IKEA parts, and my bed shoved into the corner of the bedroom, always unmade because I fell into it exhausted and woke up the same way. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of my mother, her smile frozen in time, taken 2 years before the cancer took her. She'd been so proud when I got this job, had called everyone she knew to brag about her son, the software engineer. I wondered what she'd think seeing me now, broken, humiliated, working myself to death for a man who saw me as nothing more than a joke. I made myself dinner that night, instant ramen with an egg cracked into it, the meal of champions and failures alike. The kitchen was barely big enough to turn around in, with a stove that only worked on 2 burners and a refrigerator that hummed so loud I'd learned to sleep through it. I ate standing at the counter, too tired to even sit down, scrolling through my phone without really absorbing anything. My bank account sat at $847, despite the fact that I'd been working 60-hour weeks for months. Rent was due in 5 days, $1,350 for this glorified closet in a building where the heat barely worked in winter and the AC was a joke in summer. My credit card statement sat unopened on the counter, but I knew what it said. $12,000 in debt accumulated slowly over 2 years of trying to live in a city that ate people like me alive. Richard Brennan probably spent more than that on a weekend vacation. The thought made my stomach turn, and I pushed the half-eaten ramen away, suddenly unable to swallow another bite. This was my life. 31 years old, broke, exhausted, and invisible. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it finally did, it was fractured and restless, filled with dreams of endless code that wouldn't compile, and Richard's laughter echoing through empty hallways. I woke up at 4:47 a.m. to the sound of my neighbor's baby crying through the paper-thin walls, and I lay there in the dark, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a map of some country I'd never visit. My body ached in that specific way that comes from sitting hunched over a computer for too many hours, my lower back screaming, my wrists tender from repetitive strain. The humiliation from yesterday had settled into my bones overnight, transformed from hot shame into something colder and harder, a stone I'd carry in my chest. I thought about my father, dead now for 6 years, and how he'd worked construction his entire life, come home every day with concrete dust in his lungs and pride in his chest, because he'd built something real. What had I built? A career where I could be mocked by a man half as intelligent and twice as cruel, a life where I worked myself to exhaustion and had nothing to show for it? The subway ride to work that Friday morning was the same as every other. Packed bodies, the smell of coffee and anxiety, the rhythmic screech of metal on metal as we hurtled through tunnels beneath the city. I stood pressed against the door, my laptop bag heavy against my shoulder, surrounded by other people heading to jobs they probably hated, all of us trapped in the same machine. A woman next to me was doing her makeup using her phone camera as a mirror, carefully drawing on eyebrows that would face another day in corporate America. Across from me, a man in a wrinkled suit was already asleep, his head bobbing with each lurch of the train, and I wondered what kept him up at night. Everyone had their struggles, their private humiliations, their moments of wondering if this was all life had to offer. But somehow that thought didn't comfort me. It just made the world feel heavier, like we were all drowning together and pretending we knew how to swim. When I emerged from the subway at Canal Street, the September morning was already hot, the kind of sticky humidity that made your shirt cling to your back before you'd walked 2 blocks. Brennan Technologies occupied the 5th and 6th floors of a glass building in Tribeca, the kind of place with a lobby that tried too hard to look innovative. Exposed brick, beanbag chairs, a coffee bar that served $8 lattes. I'd been impressed by it once 3 years ago during my interview, when I thought the aesthetic meant the company valued creativity and progress. Now I knew it was just decoration, a stage set designed to attract venture capital and young talent stupid enough to believe the illusion. I badged in at 8:03 a.m., already late by Richard's standards, and took the elevator to the 5th floor, watching the numbers climb with a sense of dread I'd been feeling more and more lately. The office was open plan, which meant no privacy, no escape from the constant noise of other people's conversations and the aggressive air conditioning that kept the temperature somewhere between uncomfortable and Arctic. My desk was in the middle of the floor, surrounded on all sides by co-workers I barely knew anymore. We'd all started around the same time, full of optimism, but the job had slowly turned us into strangers who shared space without sharing lives. I spent that entire Friday moving through the motions like a ghost, fixing bugs that wouldn't matter in 6 months, attending meetings where nothing was decided, nodding along to Richard's mandates about efficiency and maximizing output while he checked his phone every 30 seconds. During the 2 p.m. stand-up, he barely looked at me when I gave my update, just waved his hand dismissively and moved on to the next person, and somehow that felt worse than yesterday's public mockery. Being invisible hurt more than being a joke. By 5:30, most of the office had cleared out, people rushing to catch trains or meet friends or simply escape, and I sat alone at my desk, staring at my personal laptop hidden in my bag. My software, the thing I'd poured my soul into, was in there, nearly complete, maybe 2 weeks away from being ready to launch. It was a project management tool specifically designed for small development teams, something I'd started building out of frustration with the clunky, overpriced systems Richard forced us to use. I'd taught myself 3 new programming languages to build it, stayed up until dawn debugging, skipped meals and social events, and any semblance of a normal life. And for what? So my boss could mock me for having ambition beyond my station. I stayed at the office until nearly 9 p.m. that Friday, long after the cleaning crew had come through, working on fixing Richard's bug reports with mechanical precision, while my mind wandered somewhere else entirely. The city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows transformed Manhattan into a grid of golden white. Millions of people living their lives in those little boxes of light. and I felt so profoundly alone, it was almost peaceful. When I finally packed up my things and headed for the elevator, I passed Richard's office, corner suite naturally, with a view of the Hudson River and furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. His light was off, had been off since he left at 4:30 to catch a flight to the Hamptons for the weekend. I stood there in the dark hallway for a moment, looking at that empty office, and something crystallized inside me with perfect clarity. I was done being small. I was done accepting crumbs from a man who saw me as disposable. I was done waiting for permission to be excellent. The elevator dinged behind me and I stepped inside, my reflection in the polished metal doors, showing someone different than who'd arrived that morning. Someone angry, yes, but also awake for the first time in years. That weekend felt like existing in a strange, suspended reality where time moved differently, slower and faster all at once. Saturday morning I woke up without an alarm for the first time in months, and instead of feeling rested, I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen, watching the brown liquid drip with a meditative focus that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with avoiding the bigger questions circling my mind like vultures. What was I doing with my life? When had I become so small, so forgettable, so willing to accept disrespect as the price of a paycheck? My apartment felt different in the daylight, not like home, but like a waiting room, a place I existed between the parts of life that actually mattered. I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter and stared at my software, at the thousands of lines of code I'd written, and for the first time in months, I couldn't remember why I'd started building it. The purpose had been buried under so many layers of exhaustion and humiliation that I couldn't find it anymore. I spent most of Saturday trying to work on the software and failing spectacularly. My concentration shattered into a million pieces I couldn't reassemble. Every time I tried to focus, I'd see Richard's face, hear his laughter, feel that burning shame spreading through my chest all over again. Around 3 p.m., I gave up and did what I always did when I couldn't think straight anymore. I went for a walk. Brooklyn in September had that perfect quality of light that made everything look both beautiful and melancholic. The summer dying slowly into autumn, leaves just starting to turn at the edges. I walked without destination, past brownstones I'd never afford, past families having weekend barbecues in their tiny backyards, past couples holding hands and laughing about something I couldn't hear. Everyone seemed to have figured out some secret to life that had been kept from me, some instruction manual I'd never received. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun was setting, painting my living room in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if I'd had the capacity to appreciate beauty. Sunday was worse. I woke up with a sense of dread so powerful it felt physical, like a weight sitting on my chest making it hard to breathe. Tomorrow was Monday, which meant going back to that office, facing Richard, existing in a space where I'd been marked as less than, where everyone had watched me get humiliated and done nothing. I tried to work on the software again and managed maybe 30 minutes before I had to stop, my hands shaking, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. I was so tired, not just physically, though God knows I was that too, but tired in my soul, tired of fighting, tired of hoping, tired of believing that hard work and dedication meant anything in a world where men like Richard Brennan thrived, while people like me barely survived. I made myself lunch, a sandwich I barely tasted, and sat on my couch staring at nothing, my mind spinning in circles that led nowhere. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to darkness, my phone showing 9:47 p.m., my neck cramped from the awkward angle I'd been sleeping at. I stumbled to my bedroom in the dark, too tired to even turn on lights, and that's when my foot connected with something solid on the floor. Pain shot through my toe and I cursed, hopping on one foot while reaching for the lamp on my nightstand. The light revealed the culprit, a book, thick and hardcover, lying face down on the floor where it must have fallen from the stack of things on my dresser. I picked it up, ready to throw it back wherever it came from, when I saw the title, The 48 Laws of Power, by Robert Greene. My Uncle Jerome had given it to me 2 years ago, right after my mother's funeral, pressing it into my hands with an intensity that felt almost desperate. "Read this when you're ready," he'd said. "It'll teach you how the world really works." I'd thanked him, brought it home and promptly forgotten about it, burying it under other books and papers and the accumulation of a life lived on autopilot. Now, holding it in my hands at nearly 10 p.m. on a Sunday night, with my career in shambles and my spirit broken, something made me open it. The pages fell open randomly, and my eyes landed on a passage that felt like it had been written specifically for this moment, for me, for right now. Law 1, never outshine the master. I read the words once, twice, 3 times, my tired brain slowly processing what they meant. Always make those above you feel comfortably superior. In your desire to please or impress them, do not go too far in displaying your talents, or you might accomplish the opposite, inspire fear and insecurity. My hands started shaking as I read further, as the implications crashed over me like waves. I'd been doing everything wrong. My late nights coding, my passion project, my desire to build something better than what existed. I'd been threatening Richard without even realizing it. He didn't mock me because I was wasting time. He mocked me because he was afraid. Afraid that I might build something that proved I didn't need him, that I was capable of more than the small box he'd tried to keep me in. The book slipped from my hands onto the bed, and I sat there in the lamplight, feeling something shift in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but something sharper and more dangerous. Clarity. For the first time in 8 months, maybe for the first time in years, I saw the situation exactly as it was, and seeing it clearly meant I could finally do something about it. I didn't sleep that night, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. Something had ignited inside me, a fire that had been smoldering under ash for years, and sleep felt like a waste of the energy suddenly coursing through my veins. I sat at my kitchen counter with The 48 Laws of Power open beside my laptop, reading passages and then staring at my software, connecting dots I'd been too exhausted to see before. Law 3. Conceal your intentions. Law 15. Crush your enemy totally. Law 16. Use absence to increase respect and honor. The book wasn't just explaining power. It was giving me a roadmap, showing me exactly where I'd gone wrong and, more importantly, how to make it right. I'd been too open, too eager, too visible with my ambitions. I'd stayed late every night, practically announcing to Richard that I was building something independent of him, something that could threaten his control. Of course, he'd tried to crush me. It wasn't personal. It was survival instinct, the natural response of someone who'd built their entire identity on being the smartest person in the room. By 4 a.m., I had a plan, not just a vague idea, but a real, concrete strategy mapped out in a notebook I'd grabbed from my desk drawer. First, I would finish my software, but in complete silence. No more late nights at the office where Richard could see me working on pet projects. No more mentions of what I was building. I would become invisible, exactly the kind of mediocre employee he expected me to be. So mediocre that he'd forget I was capable of anything more. Second, I would document everything. Every system at Brennan Technologies that my software could replace. Every inefficiency. Every complaint I'd heard from other developers about the tools we were forced to use. I'd build a case so airtight that when the time came, no one could deny that what I'd created was superior. Third, I would launch quietly, targeting small development teams first, building a user base and reputation, while Richard remained completely unaware of what was happening. By the time he noticed, it would be too late for him to do anything but watch. Monday morning, I walked into Brennan Technologies at exactly 8:30 a.m. Not early, not late, perfectly average. I'd dressed in the same plain button-down and khakis I always wore, made my face as neutral and forgettable as possible, and when I badged in, the security guard barely looked up. Perfect. Invisible. The office buzzed with its usual Monday energy, people complaining about their weekends being too short, clustering around the coffee bar, slowly easing into the work week. I went straight to my desk, booted up my computer, and opened the bug tracking system Richard had assigned me on Friday. For the next 8 hours, I fixed bugs with mechanical efficiency, attended meetings where I contributed the bare minimum, and responded to emails with professional blandness. When Richard walked past my desk around 2 p.m., I didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, just kept typing. I could feel his eyes on me for a moment, probably trying to decide if I was sulking or simply defeated, and then he moved on. Good. Let him think he'd broken my spirit. Let him think the humiliation had worked exactly as intended. At 5:31 p.m., I shut down my computer and left with everyone else, catching the subway home in the crush of rush hour like a good little corporate drone. But when I got back to my apartment, I ate dinner quickly, grilled chicken and rice I'd meal prepped on Sunday, showered, made a pot of strong coffee, and sat down at my desk with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. From 7 p.m. until 2 a.m., I worked on my software with a focus that bordered on meditative. Every line of code I wrote was intentional, every feature designed with precision, every bug squashed before it could multiply. I wasn't building anymore out of hope or passion. I was building out of strategy, out of calculated revenge, out of a cold understanding that this software was my ticket out of Richard Brennan's world and into my own. The exhaustion I'd felt all weekend had transformed into fuel, and the 48 laws of power sat open on my desk like a Bible, reminding me why silence was strength, why concealment was power, why patience was the deadliest weapon. This became my rhythm for the next 2 weeks. Perfect mediocrity at work, absolute dedication at home. At the office, I became the model of an employee who'd learned his place, arriving on time, leaving on time, completing assignments without complaint or creativity, eating lunch at my desk while scrolling mindlessly through my phone like everyone else. I made small talk about sports I didn't watch and shows I didn't care about. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I made myself so unremarkable that I started to disappear from Richard's radar entirely, and I could tell it was working because he stopped watching me, stopped making comments, stopped caring. To him, I'd become exactly what he wanted, a competent cog in his machine, humbled and harmless. But at night, in my apartment with the city lights glowing through my window, I was someone else entirely. I was the architect of my own future, building something Richard's money couldn't buy and his cruelty couldn't touch. By the end of September, my software was complete, fully functional, tested, documented, and ready to launch. I'd built an onboarding system, created tutorial videos, designed a pricing structure that undercut every competitor by 40% while still being profitable. I'd set up an LLC, opened a business bank account, and registered a domain, streamlineops.io. Everything was ready. I just had to pull the trigger. October 1st arrived with a crispness in the air that felt symbolic, like the world itself was turning a page. I woke up that Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. without an alarm, my body buzzing with an energy that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with what I was about to do. Today was launch day. I'd spent the previous night doing final checks, running through every scenario, testing every feature one last time until I was certain, absolutely certain, that Streamline Ops was ready. I made my coffee slowly, deliberately, standing at my kitchen window watching the sun rise over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that felt almost like a blessing. My hands were steady as I opened my laptop, navigated to my deployment dashboard, and hovered my cursor over the button that would push everything live. One click. That's all it would take to change everything. I thought about my mother, about my father, about every person who'd ever been made to feel small by someone with more power and less vision. Then I clicked. The software went live at 5:47 a.m., and I spent the next hour monitoring systems, watching traffic, making sure nothing broke under the weight of actually existing in the real world. Everything ran smoothly, perfectly even, and by 7 a.m., I'd posted my launch announcement across Reddit, Twitter, LinkedIn, and every developer forum I'd been quietly participating in. The pitch was simple. Tired of bloated, overpriced project management tools? Streamline Ops gives you everything you need for the price, built by a developer, for developers. Free 30-day trial, no credit card required. I kept my name off it initially. This wasn't about ego, it was about the product. And then I got dressed for work like it was any other day. Grey slacks, blue button-down, the same backpack I always carried. When I walked out of my apartment at 7:53 a.m., I was still Marcus Thompson, mediocre developer at Brennan Technologies, but I was also something else now, something Richard would never see coming. Work that day was almost surreal in its normalcy. I sat at my desk fixing bugs, attended a meeting about Q4 projections where Richard spent 30 minutes saying nothing in as many words as possible, ate my packed lunch at my desk while my phone buzzed quietly with notifications I couldn't check. By 3 p.m. I allowed myself a quick bathroom break where I could finally look at my phone, and what I saw made my heart skip. 17 sign-ups. 17 companies had signed up for Streamline Ops in less than 10 hours, and the Reddit post had 247 upvotes, with comments from developers praising the interface, the pricing, the fact that someone finally understood what they actually needed. My hands shook slightly as I scrolled through the comments, reading feedback from strangers who had no idea they were giving me the validation I'd been starving for. One comment in particular stood out. "Finally, a PM tool that doesn't feel like it was designed by people who've never written code. This is clean. Signing my team up now." I screenshotted it, saved it to my phone, and went back to my desk feeling like I was floating 6 inches above the ground. The rest of that week passed in a beautiful dual reality. By day, I was the invisible developer, the humbled employee who'd learned not to dream too big or stay too late. I arrived at 8:30, left at 5:30, did my work with competent mediocrity, and gave Richard absolutely no reason to think about me at all. But by night, I was building an empire in my one-bedroom apartment, responding to customer support emails, fixing small bugs users reported, watching my sign-up numbers climb steadily. By Friday, I had 43 paying customers, small teams mostly, 5 to 10 developers each, but that meant $2,150 in monthly recurring revenue. Real money. Money I'd earned not from begging for scraps at Richard's table, but from building something people actually wanted. I withdrew my first paycheck Saturday morning, $500 to cover immediate expenses, and stood at the ATM watching those bills slide out, crisp and real, and I had to blink back tears. This was mine. Nobody had given it to me. Nobody could take it away. By the end of October, Streamline Ops had 127 paying customers and was generating $6,200 in monthly revenue. I'd reinvested most of it back into the business, better servers, a professional designer to polish the interface, ads targeted at developer communities. But I'd also paid off $3,000 of my credit card debt and caught up on bills that had been drowning me for months. At work, nothing had changed. Richard still walked past my desk without seeing me, still made his pronouncements in meetings like he was Moses descending from the mountain, still left at 4:30 every day to go do whatever rich men do with their afternoons. The rest of the team continued their routines, trapped in the same cycle I'd been trapped in, and sometimes I felt almost guilty watching them, like I'd found the exit door and was sneaking out without telling anyone. But that guilt never lasted long. I'd offered to show people my side projects before, back when I was naive enough to think collaboration mattered more than credit. They'd been too tired, too busy, too defeated to care. Now I was too focused on my own survival to carry anyone else. November brought cold winds and a shift I could feel in my bones, like the universe was rearranging itself in ways I couldn't quite see yet, but knew were coming. Streamline Ops had crossed 200 customers, and the revenue was now enough that I could have quit my job at Brennan Technologies and survived. Not comfortably, but survived. But I didn't quit. The 48 laws of power had taught me something crucial. Never seem to be in a hurry. Hurrying betrays a lack of control over yourself and over time. I wasn't going to run from Richard's office like a man escaping prison. I was going to walk out on my own terms, at the exact right moment, when my departure would mean something more than just my freedom. So I stayed, kept playing the role of the forgettable developer, while at night I refined my business, improved my product, and watched my customer base grow with the kind of exponential curve that made my hands shake when I looked at the graphs. I'd hired my first contractor, a designer named Lisa from Portland, and a part-time customer support person named James, who handled emails while I slept. It was starting to feel real, like an actual company, instead of just a dream I was keeping alive through sheer will. The first crack in Richard's reality came on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. I was at my desk pretending to debug a login system when I heard his voice from across the office, sharp and irritated, in a way that made everyone's keyboards go quiet. What do you mean they switched providers? We've had them for 3 years. He was on the phone, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his free hand gesturing angrily at nothing. I kept my eyes on my screen, but every sense in my body was tuned to that conversation. Streamline Ops? What the hell is Streamline Ops? My heart started pounding, but I forced my face to remain neutral, my fingers to keep typing random characters that looked like code. Well, find out why they left and get them back. Offer them a discount. Offer them whatever they want. He hung up, stood there for a moment staring out at the city, then stormed into his office and slammed the door. Around me, people exchanged glances and gradually returned to work, but I sat very still, processing what had just happened. One of Richard's clients had left, and they'd left for my software. I didn't allow myself to smile until I was alone in the bathroom 10 minutes later, standing at the sink, staring at my reflection with something like wonder. It was happening. The thing I'd built in secret, the thing Richard had mocked and dismissed, was now good enough, professional enough, valuable enough, that his own clients were choosing it over his company's expensive, clunky alternative. I splashed cold water on my face, took 3 deep breaths and went back to my desk wearing the same neutral expression I'd perfected over the past 2 months. That afternoon, I pulled up my customer dashboard and searched through the list until I found them. Meridian Digital, a 12-person development shop in Austin that had been using Brennan Technologies' project management system for years. They'd switched to Streamline Ops 3 weeks ago. I hadn't known they were Richard's client. I didn't track where customers came from, only that they came. But now that I knew, the victory tasted sweeter than anything I'd experienced in years. This wasn't just about building a successful business anymore. This was about dismantling Richard's empire one customer at a time, with him completely unaware that the weapon destroying him had been forged right under his nose. Over the next 3 weeks, it happened twice more. Richard lost another client to Streamline Ops, then another, and each time his mood in the office grew darker, more volatile. He started having closed-door meetings with the sales team, demanding answers, implementing new client retention strategies that basically amounted to panicking and offering desperate discounts. He hired a consultant, some guy from McKinsey who walked around the office with a clipboard asking intrusive questions about our workflows, and that consultant's report apparently confirmed what Richard didn't want to hear. Brennan Technologies was overpriced, under-delivering, and losing ground to more agile competitors. I watched all of this unfold like I was watching a movie I'd already seen, knowing exactly how it ended, because I was the one writing the script. During a company-wide meeting in early December, Richard stood at the front of the room looking older somehow, more tired, and announced that we'd need to tighten our belts in Q1, code for no raises, no bonuses, possible layoffs. People around me shifted uncomfortably, worried about their jobs, their mortgages, their families. I felt bad for them, genuinely, but not bad enough to stop what I was doing. December was when everything accelerated. Streamline Ops crossed 400 customers and $19,000 in monthly recurring revenue. I'd reached the point where I was making more from my business than from my salary at Brennan Technologies, and the growth showed no signs of slowing. I hired 2 more contractors, a back-end developer to help with scaling, and a marketing specialist who understood the developer community better than I did. We launched new features based on customer feedback, improved our onboarding process, and started getting organic press coverage from tech blogs that had noticed our rapid growth. TechCrunch did a small piece. Streamline Ops, the project management tool taking on industry giants. They interviewed me, via email, keeping my photo and full background vague, and I talked about building software that developers actually wanted to use, about keeping prices fair, about focusing on value instead of venture capital and hockey stick growth projections. The article went live on December 18th, and by Christmas Eve I had 523 customers, and Richard Brennan had lost 7 clients to my platform. 7 clients who'd collectively been paying his company over $40,000 per month. I knew this because one of them, a woman named Sandra who ran a development agency in Seattle, had emailed me personally to thank me for building something that actually works, and mentioned casually that she'd finally ditched Brennan Tech's overpriced garbage. I saved that email. I was going to need it soon. January came in cold and brutal, the kind of winter that made you question why anyone chose to live in New York voluntarily. I walked to the subway each morning with my breath visible in the air, my hands shoved deep in my coat pockets, my mind running calculations that had nothing to do with the code I'd write at Brennan Technologies, and everything to do with the business I was building in secret. Streamline Ops had become something I could barely believe was real. 627 customers, $29,000 in monthly recurring revenue, features being requested by companies I'd heard of, companies with real budgets and real influence. I'd moved beyond just surviving. I was thriving in a way that felt almost surreal, like I'd slipped through a crack in reality into a parallel universe where hard work actually mattered and talent actually got rewarded. At night, I'd lie in bed staring at my phone, refreshing my revenue dashboard like it was a drug, watching those numbers climb with an satisfaction that bordered on obsessive. This was mine. Every dollar, every customer, every line of code, mine in a way that my job at Brennan Technologies had never been and never would be. The office had become a graveyard of morale by mid-January. Richard had instituted a hiring freeze, cancelled the annual company retreat, and walked around with the energy of a man watching his empire crumble in slow motion without understanding why. He'd gained weight, I noticed. Stress eating, probably. And there were bags under his eyes that suggested sleep wasn't coming easy anymore. Part of me felt something almost like pity watching him deteriorate, but then I'd remember that conference room 8 months ago. His laughter, the way he'd made me feel like nothing in front of everyone, and the pity evaporated like steam. He'd chosen to humiliate me instead of supporting me, chosen cruelty over leadership, and now he was paying the price for that choice without even knowing I was the one collecting the debt. During a team meeting on January 15th, Richard announced that Brennan Technologies had lost 12 major clients in Q4, that revenue was down 23%, and that difficult decisions would need to be made soon. People around the table looked sick with worry, and Richard's eyes swept across us like we were personally responsible for his failures. When his gaze landed on me, I met it with perfect neutrality, just another concerned employee wondering about job security, and he moved on without a second thought. That night I sat at my kitchen counter with The 48 Laws of Power open to Law 28. Enter action with boldness. I'd been patient for months playing the long game, building my foundation in silence while Richard floundered. But patience had its limits, and I could feel in my bones that the time was approaching, the moment when I'd step out of the shadows and show him exactly what I'd built while he wasn't paying attention. I started drafting my resignation letter, but not the kind of bland, professional template most people used. This one would be different. This one would be a statement, a revelation, a knife turned slowly so he felt every inch of the blade. I wrote and rewrote it 7 times over the next week, refining each sentence until the tone was perfect, professional but pointed, respectful but devastating, revealing just enough to make him understand what he'd missed while being too arrogant to pay attention. By January 23rd, I had a final version saved on my laptop, ready to send the moment I decided the time was right. The decision came on January 28th, a Friday afternoon when Richard called an emergency all-hands meeting at 4 p.m. We all filed into the main conference room with that specific dread that comes from knowing bad news is coming, but not knowing how bad. Richard stood at the head of the table looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 months, his expensive suit hanging a little looser than it should, his confidence replaced by something brittle and defensive. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," he started, and my stomach tightened despite knowing I had an escape hatch he didn't know about. "We're implementing layoffs effective immediately. 10% of staff across all departments. HR will be reaching out individually over the next week." The room went silent except for someone's sharp intake of breath, and Richard continued talking about restructuring and positioning for future growth and other corporate euphemisms for "we're failing and I don't know how to fix it." I sat there watching him, and something clicked into place with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to wait for HR to maybe call me. I wasn't going to spend another week pretending to be invested in this sinking ship. I was done. Right now. Today. I went back to my desk after the meeting, while everyone else stood in clusters whispering anxiously about who would be cut and whether their projects made them safe. I opened my laptop, pulled up the resignation letter I'd been perfecting, made one final adjustment, and attached a PDF, a one-page summary of Streamline Ops including customer count, revenue growth, and a list of the 7 former Brennan Technologies clients who'd switched to my platform. Then I addressed it to Richard with HR CC'd, my finger hovering over the send button for just a moment. This was it, the moment that would change everything, the moment I'd been building toward for 8 months without fully realizing it. I thought about my mother, about how she'd taught me that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, that nobody could take away unless you let them. I thought about my father, about how he'd always said the best revenge was building something better than what tried to destroy you. I thought about that conference room, about Richard's laughter, about every late night and every sacrifice and every moment I'd felt small. Then I clicked send, closed my laptop, packed my personal belongings into my backpack, and stood up. Around me, people were still working, still pretending Friday afternoon meant anything. But I was already gone. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and didn't look back once. I didn't go straight home that Friday evening. Instead, I walked, 20 blocks south through the cold January air, past office buildings emptying out for the weekend, past bars already filling with people desperate to forget their work weeks, past street vendors selling hot pretzels and roasted nuts that filled the air with salt and warmth. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket, notification after notification, but I ignored it, needing this moment of transition to be mine alone, uninterrupted by whatever chaos I'd just unleashed. When I finally stopped walking, I was standing in Battery Park looking out at the Statue of Liberty, barely visible through the winter haze, and I pulled out my phone to see what I'd set in motion. 43 unread messages, 12 missed calls, and one email from Richard Brennan with the subject line, "We need to talk now." I read that subject line 3 times and then I laughed, actually laughed out loud, the sound surprising me with how genuine it felt, how free. For the first time in 8 months, Richard Brennan needed something from me, and I had absolutely no obligation to give it to him. The evening air felt colder now, biting through my coat, but I didn't care. I stood there watching boats move across the dark water, feeling lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The weekend that followed was simultaneously the most peaceful and most surreal of my entire life. I woke up Saturday morning without an alarm, without the weight of dread that had accompanied every weekend for years, and I made breakfast slowly. Actual breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast, not the grab-and-go protein bars I'd been surviving on. My phone continued buzzing with messages from Richard, from HR, even from a few co-workers who'd apparently heard what happened and wanted details I wasn't ready to share yet. I ignored all of it, spent Saturday working on Streamline Ops improvements, responding to customer emails, planning features for Q2. By Saturday evening, I'd signed 15 new customers. Word was apparently spreading through developer communities that Streamline Ops was the real deal, and people were jumping ship from expensive enterprise solutions faster than I could onboard them. Sunday, I treated myself to something I hadn't done in years. I went to a movie in the middle of the afternoon, sat in a half-empty theater eating overpriced popcorn, and watched explosions on screen while my brain finally relaxed. When I checked my phone afterward, there was a voicemail from Richard. His voice sounded strained, almost desperate. "Marcus, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but we need to discuss this like adults. Call me back." I deleted it without responding. The satisfaction was quiet but profound. This man who'd made me feel powerless now needed my attention, my cooperation, my mercy, and I was under no obligation to give him any of it. Monday morning felt like the first day of a new life. I woke up at 7 a.m. not because I had to, but because I was excited about the work ahead, a feeling I'd almost forgotten existed. I made coffee, opened my laptop at my kitchen counter, and dove into Streamline Ops with the kind of focus that comes from working on something you actually care about instead of something you're obligated to do. Around 9:30, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and curiosity made me answer. "Marcus Thompson?" The voice was professional, female, controlled. "This is Jennifer Wu from Brennan Technologies' legal department. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss your resignation and certain true intellectual property concerns. My stomach tightened slightly, but I kept my voice steady. What intellectual property concerns? She cleared her throat, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Mr. Brennan believes that Streamline Ops may have been developed using company resources and company time, which would make it property of Brennan Technologies per your employment contract. We'd like to resolve this amicably before pursuing other options. I let the silence hang for a moment, feeling the power shift even through the phone line. Ms. Wu, I'd be happy to meet, but I should mention that I have time-stamped commits, work logs, and personal electricity bills that prove every line of Streamline Ops was written on my own time, on my own equipment, using my own resources. If Mr. Brennan wants to pursue this, I have documentation that will bury any claim he tries to make. The meeting happened 3 days later, in a conference room at a neutral law office in Midtown. I walked in at exactly 2 p.m. wearing my best suit, the one I'd bought for my mother's funeral and barely worn since, carrying a leather folder that contained documentation I'd been meticulously keeping for months without fully understanding why. Richard was already there, sitting at the head of the table with Jennifer Wu on his right and another lawyer I didn't recognize on his left. He looked worse in person than he had at the office, his face drawn and his eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you're losing. When I sat down across from him, he tried to summon his old authority, that commanding presence he'd used to dominate every room, but it fell flat. "Marcus," he started, his voice attempting warmth and failing, "let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. You built something impressive. I'm willing to discuss acquiring Streamline Ops, bringing you back as a senior developer, maybe even giving you a raise." I held up my hand, cutting him off mid-sentence, and the shock on his face at being interrupted was almost worth the 8 months of humiliation by itself. "Richard, I'm not here to negotiate a buyout or discuss coming back. I'm here to make something very clear. Streamline Ops is mine. Every line of code, every design decision, every customer relationship, mine. Built on my time with my money, using skills I taught myself because your company never invested in my development." I opened my folder and slid copies of my documentation across the table. Git commit logs showing timestamps between 7 p.m. and 3 a.m., electricity bills from my apartment proving increased usage during those hours, receipts for the laptop and software licenses I'd purchased personally, even a notarized statement from my landlord, confirming I'd worked from home every evening for 8 months. Richard's lawyers picked through the documents, while his face went from confident to concerned to something approaching panic. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice steady and cold, "I have documentation of every former Brennan Technologies client who switched to Streamline Ops, and not one of them was solicited. They found me organically through word of mouth and online research, because your product is overpriced and under-delivers. That's not theft, that's competition, that's capitalism. That's exactly what you've always claimed to believe in." Jennifer Wu cleared her throat, glancing at Richard with an expression that suggested she'd already told him this was a losing battle. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps we could discuss a non-compete agreement." I shook my head firmly. "No, I'm not signing anything that limits what I can build or who I can serve. You can't claim ownership of my skills or my ambition just because I used to work for you." The room fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system, and I watched Richard's face carefully, saw the moment he realized he had no leverage, no power, no way to stop what was happening. The man who'd mocked me for having dreams bigger than his small vision was now sitting across from me, beaten, and the satisfaction was sweeter than I'd imagined. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expensive leather creaking under the shift of weight, and for a long moment he just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it anger, respect, regret? Maybe all three mixed together into something he'd never felt before. "You know what's funny, Marcus?" he finally said, his voice quiet now, stripped of its usual bravado. "I actually don't remember that day in the conference room, the day I apparently mocked you about working late. I say a lot of things, make a lot of jokes I didn't realize." He trailed off and I felt something twist in my chest, not quite sympathy, but close. The moment that had defined my entire trajectory, that had fueled 8 months of silent determination, hadn't even registered in his memory. To him, it was just another Tuesday, another throwaway comment, another display of casual cruelty that meant nothing because he'd never had to experience being on the receiving end. "That's the problem, Richard," I said, keeping my voice level even though emotions were churning underneath. "You didn't realize because you never had to. You've never been the person whose dreams get laughed at, whose work gets dismissed, whose ambition gets treated like a character flaw instead of an asset. You've spent your entire career being the guy in charge, and somewhere along the way you forgot that the people working for you are actually people, with feelings, with goals, with the capacity to build something without your permission or approval." Jennifer Wu looked like she wanted to interrupt, probably to stop Richard from saying anything that could be used against him later, but he waved her off. "So what happens now?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, maybe even a hint of resignation. "You ride off into the sunset with your successful startup and I'm left picking up the pieces?" I considered the question carefully, aware that whatever I said next would define how this story ended, at least this chapter of it. "What happens now is you learn the same lesson I had to learn, that loyalty goes both ways, that talent deserves respect, and that the people you step on while climbing up are the same people you'll meet on your way down. Streamline Ops is going to keep growing. I'm going to keep building it, keep improving it, keep treating my customers like partners instead of revenue streams. And if that means former Brennan Technologies clients keep switching to my platform, that's not revenge. That's just the natural consequence of you providing inferior service at inflated prices." I stood up, collecting my folder, and Richard didn't try to stop me. "For what it's worth," I added, "I don't hate you, I'm actually grateful. You taught me exactly who I didn't want to become, and sometimes that's the most valuable lesson a boss can provide." I walked out of that conference room and into the February afternoon feeling something I'd been chasing for months without knowing it. Closure. Not the dramatic, explosive kind you see in movies, but the quiet, dignified kind that comes from knowing you don't need someone's approval or apology to move forward. Richard Brennan would continue running his company into the ground, or maybe he'd learn something and turn it around. Honestly, it wasn't my problem anymore. I had my own empire to build, my own customers to serve, my own future to create. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun was setting over Brooklyn in shades of orange and purple, and I sat at my kitchen counter checking my email. Streamline Ops had crossed 700 customers while I'd been in that meeting. Monthly recurring revenue was now at $34,000. I had interview requests from 3 tech podcasts and 2 industry publications. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, my designer. "Just saw the TechCrunch article got updated with your full interview. You're trending on Twitter." I opened Twitter and there it was. My name, my story, my software getting recognition from people who understood what I'd built and why it mattered. That night I did something I hadn't done in almost a year. I called my uncle Jerome, the one who'd given me the 48 Laws of Power at my mother's funeral. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Marcus, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Your aunt told me she saw something about you online, said you started some kind of tech company." I smiled, looking at the book sitting on my desk where it had lived for months, guiding me through the darkest period of my professional life. "Yeah, Uncle Jerome, I did. And I need to thank you. That book you gave me, it changed everything. It taught me how to see the game I was playing, how to move strategically instead of emotionally, how to build power instead of just complaining about not having it." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of you, nephew, not because you're successful, though she would be proud of that too, but because you didn't let them break you. You bent, but you didn't break, and that's everything." The months that followed felt like watching a time-lapse video of a plant growing. Slow enough that you couldn't see the change moment to moment, but fast enough that when you looked back at where you'd started, the transformation was undeniable. By April, Streamline Ops had over 1,200 customers and was generating $68,000 in monthly recurring revenue. I'd hired a small team, 3 full-time developers, 2 customer support specialists, and a marketing manager named Keisha, who understood the developer community better than anyone I'd ever met. We were still small, still scrappy, still working remotely from our respective apartments and coffee shops, but we were real. A real company with real employees who depended on the paychecks I signed every 2 weeks, with real customers who trusted us with their businesses, with real responsibilities that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd moved out of my cramped Brooklyn one-bedroom into a 2-bedroom in Fort Greene with actual space to breathe, actual furniture that wasn't second-hand, actual windows that let in real sunlight. It wasn't luxury. I was still reinvesting most of the profit back into the business, but it was mine earned through work I believed in, and that made all the difference. I started getting calls from venture capitalists around that time, smooth-talking people with too much money and too little understanding of what I was actually building. They'd throw around terms like unicorn potential and hockey stick growth and Series A funding, painting pictures of Streamline Ops becoming the next billion-dollar startup if I just take their money and let them guide the strategy. I took exactly 3 of these meetings before I understood they were all selling the same poison. Grow fast, grow recklessly, prioritize valuation over value, become exactly the kind of bloated, overpriced, customer-hostile company that Streamline Ops existed to replace. After the 3rd meeting, some guy from a Sand Hill Road firm who spent 40 minutes explaining how I needed to think bigger while checking his Rolex every 5 minutes. I made a decision. No venture capital. Not now, maybe not ever. I'd grow Streamline Ops at a sustainable pace, keep it profitable, keep it focused on serving developers instead of serving investors. It meant slower growth, sure, but it also meant I'd never have to compromise the principles that had built this company in the first place. By June, the inevitable happened. Brennan Technologies announced layoffs. 40% of staff, effective immediately, with Richard himself stepping down as CEO and being replaced by some turnaround specialist brought in by the board. I heard about it through a former co-worker who'd managed to survive the cuts, a guy named Devon who'd always been decent to me, who reached out via LinkedIn to tell me the news and ask, half-joking, if Streamline Ops was hiring. I told him to send his resume, and 2 weeks later he was part of my team, bringing institutional knowledge of what didn't work at Brennan Technologies and helping us avoid those same mistakes. Over the next few months, 3 more former Brennan employees joined Streamline Ops, not because I was poaching, I made a strict policy against that, but because word had spread that we treated people well, paid fairly, and actually listened when they had ideas. My team was small but mighty, and more importantly, they were invested, not just financially but emotionally because they understood we were building something that mattered. Richard Brennan faded from my thoughts gradually, the way a nightmare loses its power once you're fully awake. I heard through the industry grapevine that he'd taken a consulting position at some mid-tier tech company, that he'd sold his shares in Brennan Technologies at a significant loss, that he'd moved out of his Tribeca penthouse into something more modest in New Jersey. I felt neither joy nor sadness at these updates, just a distant sense of narrative completion, like watching the final chapter of a book you'd already emotionally finished chapters ago. The man who'd defined himself by power and control had lost both, not through any direct action of mine, but through the natural consequences of treating people as disposable and innovation as threatening. I hadn't destroyed Richard Brennan. He'd destroyed himself. I just refused to go down with his ship, and sometimes that's the most powerful form of revenge, building something better and leaving the rubble behind. September marked 1 year since I'd launched Streamline Ops, and I spent that anniversary doing something that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. I took a vacation. A real one, not a long weekend where I secretly worked the whole time, but an actual week in Puerto Rico where I turned off Slack notifications, put my laptop in a drawer, and spent my days reading on the beach and my nights eating food I hadn't microwaved in a plastic container. On the 3rd day, sitting under a palm tree with my feet in the sand, I pulled out the 48 Laws of Power one more time, flipping through pages I'd read so many times they were worn soft at the edges. Law 48, the final one, caught my attention. Assume formlessness. The idea that true power meant being adaptable, unpredictable, impossible to pin down or destroy because you weren't rigid in your thinking or your identity. I realized, sitting there with ocean waves providing soundtrack, that I'd spent the past year doing exactly that, refusing to be defined by Richard's limitations, refusing to accept the box he'd tried to trap me in, constantly evolving and adapting and growing beyond anyone's expectations, including maybe especially my own. When I returned from Puerto Rico, there was an email waiting in my inbox that made me read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It was from Richard Brennan, sent from a personal Gmail account instead of his old corporate email, with the subject line, "A conversation if you're willing." The message itself was brief and surprisingly humble. He asked if I'd be open to meeting for coffee, said he had something he wanted to discuss, promised it wasn't about legal action or trying to acquire Streamline Ops. Against my better judgment, or maybe because of some curiosity I couldn't quite suppress, I agreed. We met on a Tuesday morning at a small coffee shop in the West Village, the kind of place with exposed brick and overpriced lattes that we both would have made fun of in a different life. Richard looked different. Older, yes, but also somehow lighter, like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for years. We exchanged awkward greetings, ordered our drinks, and sat at a corner table away from other customers. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Richard started, stirring his coffee without drinking it. His eyes focused on the swirling liquid, like it held answers he was searching for. "I just wanted to say something I should have said a year ago. I'm sorry. For that day in the conference room, for all the ways I dismissed you and everyone else who worked for me, for building a company culture where cruelty passed as leadership and fear passed as motivation. I've had a lot of time to think this past year. Too much time, honestly. And I realized that losing my company wasn't the worst thing that happened. The worst thing was realizing I'd become the kind of person I used to hate when I was starting out. Back when I was the hungry kid with big dreams and no resources. He finally looked up at me, and I saw genuine remorse in his eyes, the kind you can't fake. You didn't just build a better product, Marcus. You became a better version of what I could have been if I hadn't let success turn me into an asshole. I sat with that for a moment, watching steam rise from my own untouched coffee, feeling a complexity of emotions I hadn't expected. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally replied, meaning it more than I thought I would. "But you need to understand something. I didn't build Streamline Ops to punish you or to prove you wrong. I built it because I needed to prove something to myself, that I was capable of more than what you saw, that my ambition wasn't naive or foolish, that hard work and vision could actually matter if I controlled the direction. You were the catalyst, sure, but the story was never really about you. It was about me finding the courage to bet on myself when nobody else would." Richard nodded slowly, processing that, and something shifted in his expression. Maybe relief that he wasn't the villain of my story, just a supporting character in my journey. We talked for another 20 minutes, awkward but genuine, and when we parted ways on the sidewalk, we shook hands like two people who'd shared something important, but would probably never see each other again. And that felt exactly right. Streamline Ops continued growing through the fall and into winter, hitting 2,100 customers and breaking 6 figures in monthly recurring revenue by December. I'd learned to delegate, to trust my team, to build systems instead of just working harder. The company was becoming something bigger than just me, evolving into an actual organization with values and culture and processes that would outlive any single person's involvement. I hired a COO, a woman named Patricia, who'd scaled 3 startups and had the kind of operational genius that made everything run smoother, and slowly started stepping back from day-to-day management to focus on product vision and strategy. It felt strange at first, letting go of control after holding everything so tightly for so long, but the 48 laws of power had taught me that. Real power wasn't about controlling everything. It was about building something that didn't need your constant intervention to survive. I was becoming formless, adaptable, creating something that could grow beyond my limitations. And in letting go, I found a different kind of freedom than I'd been chasing all along. On a cold evening in late January, almost exactly 2 years after Richard had humiliated me in that conference room, I sat in my Fort Greene apartment with my laptop open, looking at numbers that still sometimes made me dizzy with disbelief. Streamline Ops, 2,147 customers, $142,000 in monthly recurring revenue, 15 full-time employees, mentioned in 3 major tech publications, as one of the companies to watch in the developer tools space. I'd paid off all my debt, had 6 months of emergency savings, was contributing to a retirement account for the first time in my life. But more than the money, more than the success, what mattered was this. I'd built something that mattered, something that made developers' lives better, something that proved you didn't need venture capital or corporate backing or anyone's permission to create value. I thought about my parents, gone but somehow present in this moment, and I hoped they could see what their son had become. Not perfect, not a billionaire, but someone who'd faced humiliation and chose to transform it into fuel instead of poison. I want to tell you something. Whoever you are listening to this story, your Richard Brennan is out there. Maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a partner, maybe it's a family member or a friend or society itself. Someone who's made you feel small, who's mocked your dreams, who's tried to convince you that ambition beyond your current station is foolishness. And I want you to know that they're wrong. Not because hard work guarantees success, it doesn't, but because you have more power than you think you do, more capacity to change your circumstances than anyone who benefits from you staying small will ever admit. The book that changed my life, The 48 Laws of Power, taught me to see the game I was playing clearly, to move strategically instead of emotionally, to build power instead of just wishing for it. But the real lesson, the one that mattered most, was simpler. Bet on yourself when nobody else will, work in silence until your success makes noise, and never let someone else's limitations become your ceiling. 2 years ago, Richard Brennan mocked my late nights coding. Today, he's one of 2,847 people paying me every month to use the software I built. That's not revenge, that's resurrection. That's what happens when you refuse to stay buried. Now go build something that proves them all wrong. I'll be here, still building, still growing, still refusing to be small. And if you ever launch something that competes with Streamline Ops, bring it. That's how we all get better. That's how we all become formless.